Noam Chomsky from MIT, emeritus professor from MIT, of course known by many as the father of linguistics, but also ever since the Vietnam War as a prominent critic of U.S. policy. Professor Chomsky, President Bush made what is thought to be the final speech. He used it to justify the invasion of Iraq on the basis that 9/11 proved that the United States is in great danger. Your thoughts?
Well, the United States and the rest of the world is in danger, and in fact the invasion of Iraq has significantly increased that danger. Using government statistics, terrorism analysts have shown that terror attacks increased by a factor of 7 after the invasion of Iraq. The most careful scholarship on the jihadi movement, fellows Gerges and others, has shown that in fact the invasion of Iraq inspired the jihadi movement, which originally had been highly skeptical and in fact quite critical of Osama bin Laden's adventurism, but that reconstructed it. So yes, the U.S. is in danger, and the danger is increased, predictably. I mean, it was anticipated that the invasion of Iraq would increase terror.
And he called Yasser Arafat, the late Yasser Arafat, a thief and a terrorist, and yet said things were hopeful by implication in Gaza. Just who was this speech addressed at, or addressed to?
Well, the speech is he's trying desperately, of course, to create some kind of a legacy. The administration, many historians across the spectrum describe this as maybe the worst presidency in American history. And Bush is naturally trying to resurrect something that will be a legacy that he can, that'll improve his image. But just about every of the various statements that were quoted in the news report, one happens to be more or less accurate, and that is that Iraq has moved towards democracy. But what he didn't add is that his administration tried desperately to prevent it. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming to permit elections. They opposed elections and had various schemes to undercut them. The only reason they finally had to agree to elections was that there was a mass nonviolent protest, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Ayatollah Sistani was the symbol of it, and they simply couldn't face a nonviolent protest of that scale. So they agreed to some kind of elections and then tried to subvert them, and since then have been continuing to try to subvert them, and again fought bitterly to prevent the current status of forces agreement from being reached in its present term. So yes, there is some, it's a mixed story, but certainly better than Saddam Hussein. Yes, there are steps towards some kind of popular involvement in shaping policy in Iraq, but not thanks to George Bush. He tried to prevent it all the way along.
He did say that success in Iraq had stopped Iran from developing nuclear weapons. How would you characterize his Iran policy and, given the Israeli media reports, the likelihood of a unilateral strike on Iranian nuclear facilities?
Well, there are two Bush administrations, remember. The first one was aggressive, violent, arrogant, led the United States into disaster after disaster, sank its reputation to probably the lowest it's ever been around the world. The second Bush administration was more moderate. Some of the more extreme figures were dismissed. Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, others. And they followed a somewhat more moderate policy. So the first administration, for example, simply rejected flat out Iran's offers for full negotiations on all issues, on nuclear issues, Israel-Palestine, and so on. In fact, the first Bush administration simply said, they actually censured the Swiss diplomat who conveyed the offer. It was that extreme. The second Bush administration was willing to be dragged unconvincingly and reluctantly into some partial, at least having representatives sit in on negotiations. It also backed off from the at least public threats and warnings that they would bomb, and they may have, in fact, we don't know the details, but they may have been restraining Israeli efforts to bomb. So the second administration is somewhat more moderate. And frankly, I wouldn't be too surprised if the Obama administration is in some ways a continuation of the second Bush administration.
And he may be unpopular around the world, but he's, of course, very unpopular in the United States. But albeit with those record low approval ratings, Barack Obama just won by single digits. Why is that?
Actually, it's the Obama election is very dramatic in many ways. For one thing, it is, I agree, it's a historic event. To have a black family in the White House is a remarkable event. You couldn't have predicted that 30 or 40 years ago. It's a tribute to the activism of the 1960s and its aftermath, that it did civilize the country, and that's an achievement. On the other hand, if you look at Obama's policies, they are pretty much those of a centrist Democrat. Nothing very different. In fact, what's kind of surprising is that he didn't win by a much larger margin. Typically, if the country is falling into serious economic decline, it's engaged in catastrophic adventures abroad and so on. In those circumstances, the opposition party typically wins by a very large margin. So what's striking in this case is how small the margin was. And in fact, if the financial crisis had been delayed by several weeks, it's possible that he might not have won. And one can ask what the reasons for this are, but my suspicion, at least a possible reason, is that both of the political parties are well to the right of the population on a host of major issues. So take Iran, for example. A large majority of Americans agree with the world opinion, with the opinion of the non-aligned countries, namely that Iran has the right to enrich uranium for nuclear energy, though of course not for nuclear weapons, that the entire region should be converted into a nuclear weapons-free zone. That would include Israel, Iran, any American forces deployed there, that all threats against Iran should be eliminated and you should move towards negotiations. But none of the candidates say anything like that. And the same is true on many other issues. And let's come closer to home. Take Cuba. The U.S. embargo against Cuba is regarded by the world not only as wrong, but illegal, as overwhelmingly opposed. The last vote in the United Nations just a few weeks ago was 183 to 3, I think. United States, Israel, and Palau, small Pacific island. It wasn't reported. You don't report things like that. But the American population is strongly in favor of eliminating the embargo and has been for decades. In fact, by now, even the Cuban-American population is opposed to it. But the state pursues its own interests, which are often independent of the public interest, even independent of business interests. So major business interests would be pleased to be able to engage on normal terms, commercial terms, with Iran and Cuba, but the state won't allow it.
We don't normally usually do this, but it is your 80th birthday coming up in a few hours' time. The team here want to wish you happy birthday. But did you ever think you'd see the kind of economic crisis that you're now seeing in the States? And you've always championed social movements and the power of them. How do you think they're going to cope this time around compared to, say, the 1930s with the kind of economic crisis your country is now facing?
Well, that there would be an economic crisis has been clear ever since the 1970s. The depth of this crisis was not predicted. But since financial liberalization took place, slowly through the 1970s and later, that's just a recipe for repeated crises. And there have been repeated serious crises. Mostly they have hit the South, the former Third World, so therefore they didn't register very heavily in Western opinion. This one is hitting home, and therefore it's right on the front pages every day. And rather strikingly, the measures that the Western countries, the U.S. and the other Western countries, are using to deal with the crisis are exactly what they refuse to allow countries of the South to use. In fact, they're exactly the opposite of IMF and World Bank requiring conditions. But this one is that there would be crises. Yes, that was clear. It's in the nature of unregulated liberalization of finance, but the depth is a surprise to most. In fact, very few economists predicted it, or other analysts. How will the popular movements cope with it? Well, you never know. There have been periods, the 1930s and the 1960s, strikingly, when popular movements were very active, energetic, and had a big influence. And that could happen again. There have been other periods when they haven't. These are very unpredictable events.
Professor Noam Chomsky, happy 80th birthday. Thank you very much for joining us.